Hey everyone, and welcome to the Color Authority. This is Judith podcasting out of Milan, Italy. I'm so excited for again another episode of my podcast. I'm going to be podcasting for the next couple of weeks and months with the most inspiring people in the world of color. So if you want to know more about color and learn about this topic, make sure you tune in to the Color Authority. Follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Instagram under the Color Authority, and let's see what my next guest has to say. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Color Authority. Today, I'm going to be speaking to Laura Perryman. Laura is an experienced color and material designer and trend forecaster who thinks strategically, has a user-centered mindset, and brings inspiration, clear, actionable insights, and design directions for brands and organizations. Her ethos is color and material should be integral, but above all, have a positive purpose for applications, products, or services. She works with companies, navigates future opportunities, and creates intelligent, empathetic, and planet-aware palettes and designs demonstrating aesthetics are key to all levels of experiences. Her in-depth background in color, knowledge of materials and manufacture, and critical understanding of the trend prediction process have enabled the creation of innovative design directions, brand color guidelines, and material development for globally renowned and respected companies. Laura currently directs Color of Saying, a UK-based CMF design studio focused on future-forward circular and emotionally connected color and material design, insight, and experiences for brands and organizations. Laura is also author of The Color Bible, published in autumn 2021, a succinct book covering 100 significant colors and their pertinence and potential for use in the world around us. Good morning, everyone, to the Color Authority, and welcome, Laura. I'm so happy to have you here on my podcast. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm really good, thank you. It's spring and it's starting to feel a little bit warmer in the UK, so yeah, I'm feeling a lot better.
I know, we're just hoping for spring, that things are just going to get better. So Laura, you are really what I'd call a material girl. You studied at the Royal College of Art, where you immersed yourself in the world of textile. And then over the past years, you've gained a great knowledge on many different materials. Can you talk a little bit about your fascination with materials in the world of design, or maybe also explain the audience a little bit what CMF is, because you are very focused on the CMF part in design, right?
Yeah, I think I was thinking a little bit about this before we started to record this podcast. Not everyone might be familiar with the word CMF, where it comes from, its origins, its like entomology basically as well. And I think, that sort of term CMF started in the 1980s actually. And it was created to describe, I suppose, a vein of work, which was to sort of help ranges create systems. So products having much more kind of ordered logic for how you might apply materials. And this was really taken up by certain brands, specifically OEM brands like automotive brands, but also consumer electronics companies as well, who wanted to have more logic and understanding and consistency for how colours and materials might be applied. And I think, it was actually born out of quite a lot of industrial processes and industrial manufacturing as well. And I think it's actually changing. I think the sort of discipline of CMF is broadening out quite a lot, and it's sort of almost releasing its sort of industrial heritage a little bit. And I think we're sort of seeing it move out of the boundaries of industrial design a little bit. And that's because, the world around us is becoming more complex and it's changing. And there's certain drivers, I think, that are integral to products and services and environments, such as, our senses and sort of connecting with our senses, things like well-being, sustainability and haptics, and all of those kind of, I suppose, areas are starting to merge into CMF design, and they're considered parts of a whole kind of holistic approach towards design. And I think CMF is kind of capturing some of those things as well. And also materials play a really big role in that too. And I think even when I studied textiles from a really early point, process driven, and I loved materials and being able to find out about what they did and how they behaved, and sort of discovering their kind of potential and their sort of potential properties that we might not know about. And I think some of that is very connected with sort of industrial materials, everyday materials such as plastics, glass, aluminium. They've always been there, I suppose, in my career as well. But I kind of started off at the Royal College really looking at kind of plastics and polymers as a textile designer. Whereas lots of my students or fellow colleagues at the time were sort of experimenting with things like silk. I was really interested in rigid plastic, so how I could get it to perform, how I could get it to have a better perception and change it through kind of colour and print and give it kind of a new value almost. And I think that's quite interesting because of where we are now, specifically with plastics and materials. You know, we've got this kind of negative connotation about plastics. There's been lots and lots brought up in the past couple of years to do with ocean plastic waste and sort of single-use plastics being having very negative impacts on the planet. There's been a lot of waste plastic around, but also it's very abundant and low value. And I think, you know, sort of the properties of plastics are actually quite interesting, and they could be brought out, could be, I suppose, revalued in different ways in order for them to be reused. And yeah, this idea of trying to revalue materials instead of lending them up into landfill and also increasing their waste even longer is a really, really important thread at the moment.
So how are you working with these plastics? Because it's clear that you are indeed working a lot in the field, or you're trying to indeed use regenerated plastics. But how do you communicate that to your customers? Just exactly as you said, plastics in this moment are not having the most sexiest sound in the industry of sustainability, right? So how are you communicating that? Because I think if people are well educated about materials, including plastics, they know they're not that bad as sometimes the media, you know, makes them look like. But how do you communicate that then with your customers? Because I think it's also in the communicative part where things are not really, you know, put forward the way they are.
Yeah, it's definitely connected to material literacy, the understanding that the sort of properties and the processes and the whole system that's behind certain materials. I think people are starting to understand the impact of plastics there, and clients and companies are starting to understand much more in depth where things are coming from and how things are made. And so I try to make sure that they're very clear about where certain materials are coming from. I give them options and connect them with suppliers and makers and developers that are being very, very clear about where things are coming from and where things can go. So it's almost giving them entire vision or entire visual on the complete life cycle of a plastic or a complete life cycle of a material, so that they understand what's actually involved in closing a complete loop on a material potentially, or keeping it in circularity, or keeping it in use for longer. And of course, there are always positives and negatives of that, such as, you know, the embodied energy that it takes to recycle plastic or PET, for instance. And also the sort of knowledge that might not be there with, I suppose, in all companies and within all design teams as well, such as, you know, like PET, if it's printed or if it's coloured, for instance, it loses 30% of its potential to be recycled, or you're losing almost like 30% in the recycling process because you're having to sort of sort. And so, you know, there could be certain components, for instance, that have very, very little colour in them because they really don't need it, and then they can be recycled quicker. And some maybe are coloured for certain aesthetic reasons or certain functional reasons, and they go down a different route to be reused. And I think it's valuing that knowledge and understanding it and taking responsibility. And I think now we're seeing lots of brands and companies and organizations taking responsibility or starting to take responsibility for what they're manufacturing a lot more.
Yep, I see that happening as well. And I think exactly what you are doing as a CMF designer, but also as a material designer, you're tapping into an important area, because there's a lot of designers, there's a lot of color designers. Not always, however, do they fully understand the circularity, just like you said, you know, the impact that certain materials have, that obviously color has when you color a material, especially when we're talking about plastic and thermoplastics, but also what color does in the recyclability of a product. A lot of people are talking about PCR, so post-consumer recycles polymers, and then they want to add on effects or they want to add on color, which obviously in the next recycling chain, that actually creates issues. Am I correct?
Yeah, definitely. It creates problems later on. And I think another kind of area is also thinking about how, these colours that are already out there can be recycled again. They also create further nuances, and actually that should be celebrated a lot more, rather than trying to apply colour again and again and again, is actually celebrating it's almost like second life colour. Mm-hmm. It means that we will have less control. There are offsets to this. And from a design point of view, from a CMF point of view, it might mean that we have to just go with the flow. We have to go with the inherent quality of a recycled plastic. We need to change our perception of recycled plastics in some ways. We need to understand that there's value in the fact that they're not perfect, or we might well have intermixed or nuanced colour that is, it's not pure. We can't say exactly what that colour is going to be, but there's new value also to be had from that. There's new value in the aesthetics that come from the processing, the material, the sort of change in the structure of the polymers, the way that they can be repressed, almost created into a new surface. The sort of process of how they can be reused and remade into a new aesthetic.
Don't you think also this is where the whole world is learning? I think what COVID-19 has taught us is that we need to let go of control, because it's very clearly that although maybe previously we thought we had a lot of control, whether that it was about our personal lives, our jobs, indeed how to color a material, and how we were almost 99% sure what that material and that color was going to look like. Maybe that's also part of where we are moving as a society, and also where we as designers are moving.
Yeah, definitely. I think, we need to be a lot more conscious about color. And it's like a two-pronged attack, really. There's understanding what color's kind of made from, where it comes from, whether it's completely synthetic, whether it's natural, whether it's biological. There are several streams to what colour is actually composed of these days. And there are new areas which mean that colour actually can be recycled really, really easily if it's the right type of colour. So, for instance, we know that kind of natural colours are much easier to recycle, and biological colour is much easier to recycle, i.e. it doesn't contaminate the material, so that it can be reused again.
Yep, exactly.
And, that understanding maybe isn't there yet. And there's so much new opportunity in this area as well. We don't know fully the potential yet of biological colour or bacterial-based colour. Mm-hmm. We know that it takes to certain materials really well. We've seen it being applied to things like textiles, specifically protein-based textile like silks. But we know it adheres to other materials as well really well, such as synthetics and some, obviously, plant-based materials as well, but that hasn't necessarily been tested at a large I'm not talking about an industrial scale, just a kind of batch-based scale, let's say. And there's so much to explore in that, because when something's natural, it can be broken down a lot easier than obviously when it's a synthetic polymer. So, it has the potential to be, I suppose, eliminated quite quickly or reused quite quickly. And so, yeah, there's some positives and negative offsets, I think, to be thought through in the design process.
Yeah. When I last saw you, we were both at the Color Marketing Group conference, and this is indeed where you showed concept that you had been working about that was indeed about natural dyes. So natural ways of coloring materials. Could you a little bit maybe explain again what this procedure was about this particular project of yours? And how do you think that something that you've done as a project, so obviously personally, how that could one day influence manufacturing in the hopefully near future?
I think in the CMG meeting, I spoke about natural colour specifically from agricultural sources, feeding a more responsible cycle of colour and textile dyeing as well. And I highlighted a couple of projects which looked at how you can harvest sort of natural dyes from kind of food waste. And I think what that kind of ultimately brings into question is how manufacturing could adapt to some of this specific waste material. And there's lots of designers investigating this at the moment, looking at how waste foods and waste agricultural natural materials can be harvested to create dye, but it's very, very locally driven.
Yeah.
So it's understanding how manufacturing could be, I suppose, joined to something that was being locally produced. so close to the site. And again, it wouldn't be for a large scale. It would be for sort of something that was quite small to medium. And these projects are kind of highlighting, I suppose, manufacturing options that are not necessarily feeding into mass manufacture. They're feeding into local manufacture. They're feeding into products that are made in a locality rather than something that's necessarily going to be shipped all over the world in a kind of global export. And I think that's really, really, really relevant compared, considering the kind of COVID crisis that we've seen ourselves in. There's been a real focus back on kind of local making, local resources, like where you're going to get your food from, where you're going to get your daily kind of objects and the things that you need to kind of live your life, have become very, very localized, and sort of almost shipping something from the other side of the world seems like quite an abstract concept in some ways now. But some of the drawbacks, I suppose, for kind of natural colour, looking, natural colour that's derived from plants or even kind of food waste, is obviously there's a finite amount. We can't grow plants and, harvestable crops everywhere on the earth. We'll never be able to facilitate consumption in that way because nature is finite anyway. But I think the sort of next step of that, and specifically in the Colour Bio piece that I put together, was looking at bacterial colour and how biological colour could be grown in really kind of in a completely different way, in sort of lab-like fermentation factories, almost having a lot less space. They don't need to take up, the full fields of crops, or there's not lots of manageable material necessarily. They produce a lot less waste in the actual dyeing process as well. And I think it just highlights even further, the shift that we're seeing towards, sort of bio design and biological systems supporting systems of life, supporting systems of symbiosis, basically. And, the future would really see, manufacture being close to other industries that might have waste products that could then be used and reused symbiotically. A little bit like, in nature, in nature, we have lots of interconnected systems or ecosystems that feed other ecosystems. And really, that's the kind of future when it comes to manufacturing. Not necessarily a huge scale operation. It's more localized.
Sounds like we're moving a little bit back into the, very, very, very long time ago, where we would use colors from nature to dye, at the time, possibly our clothing, etc. So it's interesting how we are actually going back to our very roots of coloring, yet using technology, because obviously when you're going to be creating obviously colors through bacteria in a lab, there is technology involved. But it's interesting that we're somehow creating, again, part of our heritage, retaking that back, and then with the applicable technology available right now, moving into what I would see a more sustainable way of coloring, but also utilizing materials.
Yeah, definitely. I think all of that speaks to a completely different system, a completely different approach to colouring, and purposeful as well, So we're not just taking a colour and applying it and sort of living with the result and wanting to fix those results. We're seeing the sort of element of control moving away. Some of those, organic dyes, bacterial dyes, they have other beautiful qualities about them. Like they have the ability to change, which, some people might think, oh God, something that fades, like why would I want that quality, right? Like, that's a negative connotation that we have adopted as a society, that something is wrong if it changes, right? If it changes colour. But actually there's something really beautiful in the fact that, some of these colours might respond to UV and do respond to things like UV, even pH levels, and change. Even seasonally, you could have a garment that potentially alters its colours, change through the seasons. And I think that is a really beautiful concept. It's a movement away from kind of fixed colour. And
it's actually also going with the flow and the movement of life. I mean, it's just the same as us human beings. We don't look the same as we did 10 years ago. Why would indeed our products, our colours, our carpets, our cars look like that? I think it is an interesting process in which actually those materials, those colors move a long time with you. I think that's a beautiful concept indeed. For a very different topic, but still related to COVID, of course, because we are still in the midst of COVID, although it seems that you guys in the UK are moving slowly out of it. But you have been researching resilience and how color is indeed related to building resilience during these difficult times. How can one, for example, use color in a daily ritual to overcome this difficult period of time?
Yeah, I think, this just totally highlights how multifaceted color is, because it can do so many things. It's definitely like one tool. It's several tools in one, I would say. And I think throughout COVID, it really struck me, color is really can be used by everyone, no matter what scale, in a kind of tiny accent or a big kind of injection of color. It's a really, really accessible tool. Any individual, any person, you can kind of pick up color. You can wear a bright, beautiful hat. You can pick up a flower. You can make a colorful salad, and you've kind of got access to it right there and then. You can use it and it can make you feel good really, really quickly. And I think one of the things we wanted to pick upon within this kind of colour resilience piece that we wrote, sort of during this sort of second and third lockdown wave, was that, we're in such strange times of, we're feeling isolated, lonely with our own homes. Our own homes have become like multifunctional, all experience, kind of life, work, rest, everything is in kind of like these small confined spaces at the moment. And in some ways we've been left to mitigate our own kind of personal well-being or even our health. And we really wanted to kind of put our heads together to give some more kind of tangible ways that you could kind of bring colour in everyday ways, really kind of instantaneously, looking out how colours can like lift your mood and bring joy specifically in kind of daily rituals. And so the piece and some of the tips and the kind of advice that we put together was just make sure you're not wearing your kind of sad wear anymore. There was a real kind of
no more black.
Yeah, no more black, no grey. And I think it's really interesting how, in kind of colour psychology terms, we if it's grey outside, we do move towards those colours. We sort of dull down our palettes almost, because it's connected with things like hibernation, right? And this kind of winter kind of time thinking like, I need to go to sleep now. I need to kind of draw back into myself and kind of hibernate and hibernate in our homes. And then we had this sort of wave of COVID on top of that, which made everyone just feel pretty damn miserable. And so we were thinking, like, what ways can we really action people to think, bring colour into your lives? Like, make sure you consciously choose like a really uplifting colour that will, that's got some cognitive benefit to it as well, So things like a bold pink, a bright yellow, a really kind of saturated orange, or these kind of impactful, big, bold, kind of warm colours. So making sure you kind of choose those in your, your daily outfit. Also making sure that colours like in your peripheral, even it's so simple, but just that everyday little details can make such a difference to you. So, I mean, some of the things we mentioned in the article were just adding, a beautiful plant or a beautiful set of flowers that, you can really kind of like instantaneously look at throughout your kind of working day at home, because they can give you so much pleasure and joy by knowing that they're kind of there. And we know that there's certain colours that will make us feel better, will make us feel more joyful and happy. And
what are those colours? What are those colours that really are going to make us feel better? Is that a global thing, or is that still personal?
I think it's still personal. That's what I was sort of saying in the article as well. It's about choosing colours that mean something to you and you have a strong association with. So, I mean, I chose some things that I specifically have a really strong association with that I know make me feel better. So, such as a bold pink. I think I also mentioned sort of lemonade shades and sort of slightly more sort of lemony or citrus shades, because I know that they make me feel more positive. I mean, I was totally trying to wear my yellow. I have like a series of yellow jumpers. And I'm wearing those systematically through January in order to try and make myself feel better, because there's just something about the way that light reflects off yellow that illuminates things like my skin, the way that I kind of feel as well. But I think, there can be other shades that are really important in this time as well. And some of the article kind of highlighted the sort of use of colour in the home in order to create divisions of space. because obviously our homes are becoming these multifunctional areas.
Yep.
But also to choose colour that's in tune, make colour work for us. There's certain tones that will mean that we relax quicker, we can concentrate, we can go to sleep at night. And so, for instance, working within an environment that potentially has, lots of green elements to it will make us feel better. For instance, we know this through some of that's going on in biophilic design. Natural greens will create as a feeling of well-being, or a feeling of
calmness as well.
Yeah, exactly. And whereas we know blue is quite good for concentration, certain elements of blue are very, very good for kind of concentrated work environments, for instance. But then also when you're talking about kind of winding down, we want to kind of create a different pace at a different time of day, right? So we're looking at this idea of sort of muted rose colours, muted pinks, as a way of, they can be quite full-bodied colours. They don't need to be sort of really pales. They can actually be quite nurturing, strong in terms of their saturation, but they're there to sort of bring us into a new area, our minds into a new space, which is about kind of calming down. And there are not just scientific, but there are psychological studies that have been done in the past, which connected with pink and lowering heart rate. And we've sort of seen that being picked up a lot more, even in different industries as well, such as even in activewear and in kind of public spaces as well. The use of these sort of strategic colours to calm and sort of make us feel at peace a little bit more as well.
So colour and well-being indeed is something that I've been reading a lot about it, and it seems to be the next hot topic. Where do you see this movement going in the near future? So really how we could use indeed colour, not just for COVID, but how this is entering the whole wellness and well-being sector and industry.
Yeah, I think there's certain sectors that have been using it for a while, I think, but they might not have been necessarily calling it well-being. It was kind of under the guise of sort of colour psychology for quite a long time. And in certain areas, sort of in care and public spaces, the principles of certain colours evoking certain emotions has been there for a little bit. But what I was saying a little bit about the case of, even Baker Miller pink, which we've seen, that's quite an old study now from the 1950s, but this idea of lowering heart rate being applied to like these new everyday environments or new everyday applications is actually really, really provocative of possibly where it might go. So there's an activewear company called Wellbeing who have designed a completely Baker Miller pink jacket, which is specifically designed for athletes to reduce their feeling of kind of pressure. So by lowering their heart rate, it causes them to feel like they can take the next leap. They can go beyond and push themselves out into their next kind of activity, basically. And I think that's really interesting that something, like an advanced sportswear company is taking on some of these principles of colour psychology and actually applying them in practice as well. Yep. And I think that's more of that is going to happen, I think, as we move forward. So we'll see the sort of science or psychology of colour being applied into really specific applications where it has great benefit as well. And I think we've seen a little bit, there's a really lovely project in the UK actually, which is Maggie's Healing Centre. And it was designed by someone called Abe Rogers. And it uses these beautiful tones of pink, almost corals and terracottas graduating throughout the space, interior and exterior. It's a sort of healing centre as well. So they're connecting with this idea that pink can significantly, how we feel and on almost a physiological state, not necessarily a psychological one too.
So this is almost as if we're talking about neuro-aesthetics, right? I mean, it's really about how colors impact our brain. So how we view them, how we vision them, how they enter our brain through the senses, and then how they psychologically and physiologically make us feel. And I remember Google at the time in 2019, I think, in Milan Design Week, they had this project, A Space for Being, which really triggered the design world. So it sounds like the project that you're talking about, and I can't wait to go and, once I again can fly, I'll come out to the UK and see this project that you're talking about. But I think neurosthetics is moving faster than we may think. If I hear also other brands tapping into it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area because I think what it is it's actually proof. It's data that shows that colour and tactility can actually reduce stress. So it's less hypothetical. It's more fact, putting facts on the table. And there's lots of really interesting developments in this area. Researchers working with neuro-aesthetics that are almost bringing this almost like solid scientific data to the table. You've got researchers who are almost like mapping brainwaves and functional responses, like neurological responses to specific emotions. And they're almost tapping that back to specific shades and tactile qualities as well. So you're almost getting, a neuro response connected with an actual specific shade. That is giving so much more gravitas to the subject of colour and aesthetics as well. So it's not just aesthetics for aesthetics' sake anymore. We can now really, really say that aesthetics truly affect how we feel, and we can tune them as well. Like, it gives us a bandwidth to be able to choose comfort, relaxation. And the Google project is a really good example of that, monitoring the biological responses of people in the space, their heart rate. I think they even monitored the sort of moisture level on the skin.
Yeah, galvanic. Yeah, they did.
Yeah, to kind of garner what people perceived as relaxing in terms of aesthetics. It's such an interesting area. I feel like it's going to bring a lot more consideration to colour and also tactility, more than it has ever had before. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing specific expertise developed looking at physical and visual haptics.
And that's tapping into a whole new personalization as well. I mean, because you're different, I'm different, and then I'm different on a Monday, and I might be different the Monday after. So it's very interesting how that will adapt to how we feel, even on a day-to-day basis. It's going to change completely also how designers design, because they're going to be really working in a very close relation to their consumer.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is much more on the consumer side of things. It's much more about user experiences. We know that there's certain industries that are very in tune already with user experience, such as like consumer electronics and small devices and wearables and that kind of thing. But to connect further the sort of closeness of these aesthetics with our bodies is quite interesting. And I'm sure, we know that there's certain people that are incredibly interested in this, such as Google and other big kind of tech brands, because, ultimately, as we move forward, we're closing the gap between kind of human and tech. And I'm just intrigued to see how this area might fall out into other areas, such as digital areas as well, and more digital experiences and how they can be customized, knowing what we know about neuroaesthetics as well. So kind of digital neuroaesthetics as well as physical ones, I think could be quite an interesting development for this area too.
Yeah. Laura, one last question. We both work also in the color trends field. And that's quite different from how people are going to surround themselves with colors that they, have a relation with, which they're maybe nostalgic for, or whether indeed Google told them that red is the color for their living room, for example, because that's the color that's going to make them most comfortable. How is this going to relate to some of the work that we do, for example, such as color trends?
Yeah, it is different. I think we're starting to see, sort of shifts, I suppose, within these kind of fields, specifically around, longevity with color and color with functional purpose, for instance. Perhaps in the past, we would have had, and we still do have, these systems of autumn, winter, spring, summer campaigns and a sort of set way of forecasting color for specific needs and areas, such as fashion and interiors, for instance. But more and more, we're seeing brands, I think, want to explore the sort of physical and sensorial properties of colour. And so they're wanting to almost tune colour to their specific consumer needs, I think is one thing. Understanding how colour can sort of relate to specific situations as well. And therefore, you're sort of seeing colour move away, and some CMF work move away from just every season we need to refresh our product into how can we create functional purpose and create appeal so that people have a real kind of central engagement with their products. And ultimately, if they keep them for longer, if people have a longer connection with the sort of objects and the things that they work in, the things that they consume, but ultimately keep them for longer. And that's really interesting. I think the sort of psychology of finding out what consumers' preferences are, what drives those consumer preferences, but also then matching up with, where the context of that particular product or the context of that particular application of colour, and tuning those kind of two different areas and between sort of trends and applied kind of application and colour psychology. And I think there's lots of brands that are starting to kind of breach that, almost like tuning up and down colours in a sort of slightly longer time span, and not necessarily working in a seasonal way anymore, because they're starting to understand longer term shifts in consumer preference.
Especially fashion, we're starting to see that. And I think that's moving probably across different industries and sectors very soon as well.
Yeah, I mean, I also talk very broadly in terms of groups, or I suppose industry sectors, because I do work across lots of different industry sectors. So when I prospectively look at trends, I do forecast trends for packaging, as well as consumer electronics, as well as materials, as well as colour, and maybe then automotive. So I see lots of different angles. And so I sort of make more connections with the general shifts that I see across those industries.
Because they're still aligned. I mean, it's not no such thing as there's just one trend in one area and there's another one in another trend area. There's a lot more overlapping. I think there's still some industries that are more forward in probably adapting trends. But it is key, just as you said, to look at different industries, different type of products, because that gives you such a broad view that you can really apprehend the consumer, because the same consumer may buy indeed a new pair of jeans at Levi's, and at the same time, obviously going to buy a car at, let's say, Volkswagen. They are in the end the same consumer looking for different products, perhaps, but it's interesting to see whether those profiles are similar in one industry and in the other. And that consumer behavior analysis is something that I'm personally very interested into. But I know that's something that you work with a lot as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You're right. Those consumers are interconnected across industries. And often I don't think industry looks at it like that. But I think it's important to understand the sort of changing consumer habits of specific demographics, even like consumers in localities as well, I think is becoming much more prominent. And yeah, I think, those preferences to do with how astute some of those consumers are getting, their choice and taste levels are changing quite a lot. And we've seen that move much more towards, sustainability, but, being considered and mindful of what they're kind of buying into and why they're buying it. Those are sort of running threads across those different industries, I think.
Very true. Laura, I want to thank you for this super interesting podcast. I got a lot of new information. I hope you enjoyed it very much. And I hope that maybe in the near future, we can talk again. But for now, I'd really like to thank you. And I hope you enjoyed being part of this new project of mine.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Judith, for inviting me to talk to you today. It's been really fascinating. And there's just so much to learn about colour.
So this was Judith Van Vliet from the Colour Authority. Thank you for listening again to yet another episode. If you haven't done so, please go to Apple Podcasts, subscribe, review, and send us feedback on this episode. And I hope that you will be listening to the next episode coming out very, very soon. Thank you and have an amazing, colourful day.